Hello.
Hello.
How are you?
I'm very well. How are you?
Yeah, not too bad. It's been a long time since we've both been here on the stream. First time this year.
First time this year, and we're at the end of February.
Yeah.
So thanks to everybody that's tuning in, joining us live, and to those in the future that are watching the recording. Thank you also for joining us and checking out the previously live stream.
Yes. And I suppose we should always start off with our code of conduct. So let me just bring that up on the screen right now.
Sure.
So in today's session, we ask everyone to be aware of others, be friendly and patient, be welcoming and respectful, be open to questions and viewpoints, be understanding of differences, and be kind and considerate to everyone else. So let's get rid of those. So in the chat, just be nice, don't be mean, basically. So, Carl,
Yes,
what have you been up to this last few weeks?
Working quite a bit, obviously. I mean, full time. So I mean, working quite a bit. I'm traveling a bit as well now. So my new job sees me traveling to visit clients. So I've been in London a few times in the last few weeks. Not back in London again until the end of March, but it was quite an experience because I hadn't travelled to London in what must be about 10 or 12 years. So
Oh,
lots of
wow. That's a
change in
long
that
time.
time, and I did manage to have a fight with Paddington Station the first visit because it's so huge. Got myself lost, which definitely added about 45 minutes to my journey to the client. But such is life.
Yeah.
Now I know my way around Paddington Station and can
Nice.
read the signs, which were obvious. So
That definitely helps if you can read the signs in London. And it's all color coded, the underground, so you're fine.
yeah,
So that's good. And then I guess we should also talk about, we got KubeCon coming up soon in April.
yep.
You going to that?
I am not. As I say, I'm
That's
traveling quite a lot for work, so I don't think I should force my wife to look after all of the children we have by herself for more time than is necessary. So,
yeah, good point. Good point.
what about
Right.
you?
So
What have you been up to quickly before we bring our guest
yeah,
on
so
tonight?
so I've been working on my book, which comes out in a couple of days' time, March the 3rd. As Azure Containers Explained. You can get it on Amazon and everywhere. It's all done with Pact and my co-author Wesley Hackman, who's been on the show
Are you
in
going?
last year, October, I think it was. He was
Yeah.
in on.
Do you? Can you get it in hard copy, like in a
Yeah,
hardback?
it can do print and Kindle, so it's all good.
Right.
So yeah, have a look
So
out for that.
are you gonna give some away on Twitter or LinkedIn?
Hopefully, if Pact allows it, yeah, fingers crossed. I'm working with the marketing team as we speak, so hopefully we
Okay.
should do some nice Azure Cloud Native giveaways, which will be awesome.
Some signed copies. You heard it here
Yeah,
first.
well, maybe signed ones if you're at KubeCon, because me and Wesley will be at KubeCon, so you never know. We could arrange something there.
Sounds like
And
a
I
plan.
guess with that, we should bring David in because most people are probably here to see David and not us.
Not listen to us catch up. Yep.
Exactly, yeah. So here he is, David. Hello.
Hello. Good evening. Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
No worries. Thanks for taking the time out of your busy schedule and talking to us.
Oh yeah, well, I try to manage a few talks, because I need to. I like to share my experimentation and failure, and once it starts to be working, I've write some stuff down, and I want to share it so that people don't mess up the same as much as me.
Makes sense. I know the pain when you can do something with AKS. It never always works exactly as the doc says it's going to work, is it?
Oh yeah, the doc.
yeah. Nice. So I guess you've got some slides to present. So if you want
I do.
get your screen
try to
ready.
share my screen, so I just need to not mess up with my screen, and you should see something at one point. Yes.
There we go.
Hopefully something's coming up.
So before you, well, maybe you have an introduction slide, but before you get into the meat of your talk, do you want to introduce yourself, tell the viewers a bit about yourself, and
I have a slide for that, but I would like it to show. Is it only
Yes.
me or is it not showing?
I'm just getting a blank screen now. Do you want to try resharing it and we can try again?
Yeah, I will try that. Stop screen and start again. Share screen.
So while David's figuring out the technical difficulties, if you have any questions tonight, feel free to drop them in the chat, and we will either interrupt David to ask them directly, or
It's working.
we'll save them for a natural break in his presentation. So let's get the chat going. Let's interact with each other, interact with the other viewers, and over to you, David.
Yep. Yeah. Feel free to ask question, and I guess Carl and Richard will feel free to interrupt me. That's what I ask them to do, because I tend to talk a lot, and the idea is that I share with you what I've seen. So there's no point if I cannot answer your question. Okay, so we are talking about the state of IKS identity management, because it kind of moved a lot in the last few years. There's a little bit animation. And here is the agenda. So we'll just start with a very rapid overview of what is Kubernetes architecture, and mapped it to the Azure context so that we know what we're talking about. And then we have three parts. One big part on the control plane. Without surprise, we need to talk a lot about this one, because it controls everything, so it makes sense. Then we have a little part on the worker plane and a little part on the workloads. But after all that, you will be fed up, so we'll be happy that I'm finished, I guess. So before starting, as Carl mentioned, I do have one slide about me. Maybe I should start by saying that the thing that I hate about me is picture of me, so that's why there is no picture of me, but instead a black match from Final Fantasy, which is the last point on my presentation. I do love Final Fantasy. I also have a nice t-shirt, but you cannot see it because it's too small. I'm working on Azure since quite a lot of time. I love automation and infrastructure as code, more on the HashiCorp stuff than other. I still consider myself to be struggling with the Kubernetes landscape, and because I talk so much, I've been awarded the MVP Azure Award since 2019. And I guess that's all for the introduction. Okay. Then, as I said, we will start with a little reminder of what is the Kubernetes architecture. So, there are two main parts, and I don't want to go in too much detail for now. There is the control plane, which control everything and will schedule what needs to be hosted on our workers, which brings us to the second part. We saw the workers, which basically do our servers, even in Azure, which will host what we have in our application, which can be your familiar Kubernetes object, segregated in namespace, organized with a replica set and config map and volume and service and stuff like that. So those are your basic object in Kubernetes, and this is the basic overview of the Kubernetes architecture, which brings us to the architecture mapped in the Azure world. So in the Azure world, there is a little difference in the fact that, Azure Kubernetes service is what we call a PaaS service, but sometimes a CaaS service, for container as a service, because it's kind of an hybrid service. You do have the control plane, which is the PaaS service, as you can see. You can see my arrow. Nice. So this part is the managed one, the Azure PaaS part, and under that we have the worker plane with other network stuff. But let's not talk about that for now. With the worker, which, as I mentioned, are in the Azure world, a virtual machine scale set. So we have a bunch of IaaS and a bunch of PaaS, and because of that, we have difference between what we have in the Kubernetes out-of-the-box architecture and what we have in Azure Kubernetes service. I guess this is similar to other managed Kubernetes by your cloud provider, but I don't really know about the others, so I will focus on AKS tonight. So that's it for the architecture. So before deploying Kubernetes cluster, we do have a few requirements. We need to have a resource group and a virtual network. Also an SSH key, which we will never use, but we still need that. And we will also need other things related to identity, an Azure Active Directory groups. Notice the S in parentheses, and we'll talk about that a little more later. And optionally, we can either have system assigned identity. In this case, we don't really care, but usually you will prefer to have user assigned identity. And I will also talk a little more about that later. After we deploy, we'll get virtual machine scale set, which are nodes. We'll have also a few networking stuff which are managed, so a network security group, but we will not talk about that tonight. We also have a load balancer with a public IP, even if there are ways to avoid having a public IP, but that's not the topic tonight. And more managed identity, either system assigned or user assigned. Again, more on that later when we will be in the worker plane part. Okay. Moving on. So let's deep dive deeper in the IAM for the control plane. So first thing first, we'll talk about authentication. And when we talk about AKS, because this is a managed service in Azure, we have a way to integrate the authentication with, well, the IAM control plane of Microsoft in Azure, which is Azure Active Directory. Very bad name, but very nice feature. So we can use the identity provider of our cloud platform so that instead of managing identity inside the cluster, we manage identity in the cloud platform control plane, which is good. It's very easy nowadays to integrate AKS with Azure ID. This is called the Manage Azure ID, if I remember well. It was not the case at the beginning, so be happy that we don't have to do the very complicated stuff that we used to do. For instance, if you played with Azure Arc Kubernetes, Azure Arc enabled Kubernetes, you may have seen in the documentation that we have some very complicated stuff to do with two different kinds of application registration. This is similar to what we had in the first implementation of integration for Azure Active Directory and AKS. So very simple, we have identity from the control plane in Azure ID, and we will just require to have one or more Azure Active Directory group that we will define as cluster admin. Okay, so as you can see here, I have an extract from what we get if we use a command line to query our cluster. I will show you that with a recluster just afterward. And I'm just so that probably that my cluster are shut down, so I will need to just restart them. But let me do that a little bit afterward. What was I saying? Yep. You can see that there is a properties which is called admin group object IDs, meaning that we have more than one. Not necessarily more than one, but it will be a list. And as you can see here, I have blanked the object ID because I didn't want to show it in the slide, but you will find more information on that. At the build, if we just choose AZ CLI, then we'll just have to specify this switch enable AAD and then specify a group object ID, one or more, and the Azure Active Directory tenant, only one for this. Give me a few seconds so I can just start my cluster, which I've been stopped automatically because I want to save money. And while it's starting, Perfect. It's getting started. Okay, so that's all for now for the authentication part. Once we have integrated the Azure control plane, the Azure ID control plane to our cluster, we can manage authorization. As I already mentioned, when we have authorization on the Azure Active on our cluster, the member of the admin group, the Azure Active Directory group, will be granted the cluster admin cluster role binding, binding the cluster role, the cluster admin role. You can see on the right side of my slide an extract from one cluster. There is indeed a cluster role binding in AKS, which is called AKS cluster admin binding AAD. There is the int over there, the AAD for Azure Active Directory, and the UID. We don't really care about that, but what is important here is the subject, and the subject is a kind of group, because this is a group, and then the name is the object ID of the Azure Active Directory group that you assigned at the build of your cluster. And I guess that's all for this little part. Moving on. For the admin part, it is easy. You have one group, one Azure Active Directory group, which is admin, and then you need to manage access for other people, because Kubernetes allows you to manage granular access. You should try to do that. So there is different option. The one that we will never use and that we should not use is the last one, local account with Kubernetes Airbag. The idea is to leverage the cloud platform benefits, so let's not do that, which means that we have two choices, either Azure ID authentication with Kubernetes Airbag or Azure ID authentication with Azure Airbag. There are two things, but a little bit of difference. Whatever the choice that we make, we'll use Azure ID authentication, so that the ID, the identity will come from Azure Active Directory, and then either we use Kubernetes Airbag, and then we will have to manage inside the control plane of Kubernetes the identity and the not the identity, the access with Kubernetes role binding and such. Either we use a more cloud native control plane, and we can rely on mostly Azure Active Directory, no, not Azure Active Directory, Azure built-in role or custom role, as a matter of fact, that will allow us to be more granular on which access we want to grant to our user. Let's see a little bit of the details over there. So let's put ourselves in the scenario in which we have configured we have created the cluster and configured it, and then we need to get access because we are now authenticated. How should we do that? If we are admin, we already tackled this question. It's easy. We are a member of the cluster admin group, which is bound to the cluster admin role in Kubernetes, so we can do whatever we want in the little universe of our Kubernetes cluster. Non-admin user needs something else. The fact that they are able to authenticate doesn't mean that they are able to do anything at first. They need to have authorization. That's where Airbag come along, and then we need to first get the credential on our Kubernetes cluster. There's the command for that. I will show you that, hopefully. But before being able to do that, there are two built-in roles, and we will start with one. As you can see here, the first role in the Azure control plane that we need to consider is the Azure Kubernetes Service user role. The name is not that clear, but let's focus on the user part. It means that we are user of the Azure Kubernetes Service, so we should be able to access to Kubernetes, to the Kubernetes control plane, if we are member of this role. If we have a look on the JSON definition of this role, you can see there is not that much. Action, Microsoft, container service, managed cluster, list cluster, user credential, and that's all. Another container service managed cluster read. Okay, not so much authorization, but that's enough, because with list cluster user credential, what we can do is just get the credential. So I will show you that.
Oh, David, before we show this bit, we have a question from the audience. Yep. Do you recommend Azure RBAC or Kubernetes RBAC?
I will come to that, but yeah, spoiler, I prefer Kubernetes RBAC. I will show you that afterward. You will see with Kubernetes RBAC, you remain more, you keep more control on the granularity that you want to manage. Hopefully, the counterpart is that you need to manage this granularity inside your Kubernetes control plane. While if you just manage Azure RBAC from the Azure control plane, you know that much granularity, because you assign a role to the cluster in itself. So you will be able to have role either built-in or either custom defined that give you access on the cluster wide. So it's not very granular and, in my opinion, acceptable in terms of security. Nevertheless, it's not because you have still the Azure RBAC activated that you cannot manage Kubernetes RBAC inside your cluster. But if you don't want to manage authorization on a per cluster basis, then you should focus with and stick with the Kubernetes RBAC model, in my opinion. And I guess it depends how you have your Azure Kubernetes service offer in your enterprise. Either you grant one cluster per scope, per client, I don't know, and then you don't really care. They can be admin of their own cluster, and then it makes sense to just manage at the cluster level. If you have more granularity and more shared cluster, then obviously you need more granularity. And in this way, I would recommend using Kubernetes RBAC inside your cluster. Okay.
Awesome. Brilliant. Thank you.
So let me try to show you a few commands. I will need to zoom in. So let's zoom on that. So is that readable? Yes, it seems to be readable. So as you can see, I have 3 clusters already provisioned. On those 3 clusters, you can see the name are giving us a hint. There is one which is called AD RBAC, and the other one which is called Kube RBAC. So no surprise, one is configured so that we have RBAC with AAD, and I will experiment with that afterward. And one is configured so that we have only Kubernetes RBAC, and I will show you that if we have only the cluster user role, you can get credential but not do anything else unless someone gives you access to it. I need to find where is the unzoom option. It's over there. For now, I will unzoom and then do my command. What I want to show you also is the group which is assigned to this. Oh, no, this is not something what I wanted to show you. I want to query what is the group which is assigned to my cluster. I will zoom just afterward. ZAKS, let's do that again. But I will GQ the output. And let's zoom again. I hope it's readable. And as you can see, all of my cluster have the same admin Azure AD group, which is admin. Okay. And I will have a look at the member, and I will verify that I am a member so that I can get credential and see what can be done on that. Okay. As you can see, as I mentioned, the first one is enabled for Azure RBAC. The second one is not enabled for Azure RBAC. And the third one is not enabled for Azure RBAC, but has something else. But I will come to that afterward. Let's unzoom for now. Okay. And clear my screen. And switch back to the slides for now. No, I don't want to switch to the slide yet. I want to show you something. I said that I would show you that. ZAD group member. Group member. Oh, group member list. I guess this is group name or name. Group. And I will just put the ID of my group. And I need to zoom that so that you can see it. As you can see, I have two members of my group. You can see one who is called David, that's me, and the other one who is called Spike. Funny story about that, while I was testing the access, I forgot that I put a Spike in the admin group, and I did not understand why he would still get access, while he should not have access to. So now I know that, and I think it's still funny, but I will test with another user. To test with the other user, I need a navigator. Hopefully I will be able to zoom in. So I have one member who is called Leonard and another one who is called Jet. Further reference to a TV show or other old animated is clearly wanted. No, this is not. Yes, this is it. So I'm requesting the cloud shell, and on this one, I think I can zoom more about that. Yep. Just tell me if it's still big enough. It's not, I can still zoom in. Okay. Oh, what I was looking at, this user is just member of the Azure Kubernetes service user role. So if I'm just doing a dedicated list, hopefully I should see, oh, because I'm not in the appropriate subscription. Perfect. Maybe I should put something like that. Okay, it seems to be able to get access. Let's just get the credential and see that we can get the credential. And then afterward, we'll just pass one Kubernetes command line to see that we cannot do anything, which is kind of the point. I should stop using compression with the cloud shell. It's very slow. Perfect. So let's try the command line. So I put a shortcut for kube control because I'm lazy. So there is only Kate that I need to type. So don't be surprised about that. Few context. Let's try to get nodes. If I'm still authenticated, it should be working. Well, it should be working. It should give me an error, but it should be working. Okay, so it seems that I cannot do that. Let's try to see if I can do something else. So we use the auth command and then the cani parameter, and I will try to do something like get pod. And I cannot because I don't have any access in the resource. So I need to get access. Makes sense. Okay, perfect. Let's switch back to the slides for now. So as you can see, on this one, I'm a member of this cluster, except that it changed its name because I changed my my inference code template. But I have the same result. I'm only able to list the cluster user credential. And once I've done that, if nobody is granting me access, I cannot do anything, which makes perfect sense. So I cannot do anything except if I ask an admin to to assign me a binding and to a role in the cluster. If I have time, I will do that afterward. So let's have a look now at another user. This user, with this user, we'll try to authenticate on the cluster, on the two different clusters, because I've assigned the Kubernetes service Airbag reader, which, as you can see on this little capture, allows me to get read-only access on most of the objects that it's mentioned in the Azure documentation. And if you are curious about it, you can look at the built-in role and see the role definition. You should see that we have additional authorization in the data section that we did not have in the previous role that I showed you. Okay, but because I have only granted an access on the Azure plane, my access will be dependent on what is my Airbag configuration. So remember, I have two clusters, one which is configured for AAD Airbag and the other not. So let's read on this one. This is this user, as you can see by its name. So let's try to see in the proper subscription. Oh, I'm not. So I need to change my subscription. Seems to be working. Okay, let's clear that. Okay. Config. I prep my context beforehand. I forgot about that. It seems I did. So now I'm on the. Oh, let me zoom a little bit more. I'm on the Kubernetes cluster. So let's switch back to the other one. So config use context. Okay, I switch to this cluster. Remember, well, you cannot see it, but this is just I did not as an admin on my green terminal. I did not grant access on any of the cluster. So this is just the Azure Airbag control plane that give me access to the cluster. So let's try to see if I can do something. Config, no, not config. Sorry. What can I? And yes, so let's try to do that. Indeed, I can. Perfect. Let's clear that and switch to my other cluster. Okay. And now, remember, this cluster is not configured to use Azure Airbag, only Kubernetes Airbag. So, in theory, I should not be able to do anything. Can I? Ah, and I can. Funny. An effect. Am I on the good cluster? What the S? I did not switch. Oh, it was still working. No, I cannot, which is logical because, as I mentioned, I did not grant access to this user in the Kubernetes control plane, and because I have only managed access and authorization in the Azure control plane, it does not work. Make perfect sense. Okay, so we can see the difference here again, referring to the question earlier. We can do both, configure Azure Airbag and use Kubernetes Airback. We can use only Kubernetes Airback. In this case, we don't need to keep the property to true, or we can use only Azure Airback, but it will really depend on the scope of permission that you need to assign. In my experience, it's still better to get the authentication part on Azure Active Directory and then to switch to the Kubernetes control plane for authorization management. Okay, let's move on. So this is just an example so that I can see that if I'm getting a binding, I should be able to see things. How am I on time? I'm not so in time, so let's move on. But if I was to assign a binding with the cluster role to the admin to a namespace, I would get access to this. I will grant access to this user from the Kubernetes part and not from the Azure control plane. The idea here is that we need to consider that because we are living in Azure with Azure Kubernetes service, we have two control planes to consider, and I guess that's one of the difficulties of managed Kubernetes. I have one last thing, and that's why I have another cluster. There is a you may know about that. There is a weak link if we don't do anything that is related to the inheritance of the permission in Azure. So, for instance, if I am a contributor of a subscription or a source group that would contain a Kubernetes cluster, I have a role definition which in its authorization have everything and except giving authorization to other. Okay, but within this everything is included the get credential. Until now, that's not too bad because we could imagine that a contributor of a subscription should be able to get access to Kubernetes, and even so, if he has only access to the list credential, no big deal. But remember, I mentioned that there was, well, maybe I mentioned that fast. There were two basic roles. One which is Azure Kubernetes Service user role, and the other which is Azure Kubernetes Service. I think it's admin role, and this one allows us to get the credential with the admin parameter, and with this admin parameter, I can get access to the local admin account that is configured by default on the cluster. Let me show you that. If we consider one of our cluster, let's start with this one. In the cluster configuration, I should see something about that. And you can see I have Kubernetes. Oh, let me zoom that. I have Kubernetes local account, which is checked, which means that I still have local admin, a local admin on the cluster. It might be a good idea if you are afraid of losing access because you could lose Azure AZ. Usually not the case, but on the other hand, it can be an issue because as a contributor, you can get elevated privilege. As you can see on this one, the Kubernetes local account is disabled, which means that no one can get this local admin. If I were to show you that, maybe I can try to show you that with another user. I have another user. I guess this should be Penny. If I'm connecting on a shell. I'm requesting my shell, perfect. You can see that I still have some money on my subscription, perfect also, so that I can still show you what I wanted to show you. So let's try to see my cluster at the case list in table model. And again, I'm not in the appropriate subscription, and I will just clear my screen because I don't want to do a survey now. Me when I mistype things. Okay, let's get to this cluster again. And let's try something. I can show you that maybe on this one. If I check access in the subscription, Penny has been granted elevated privilege on the subscription. If I'm doing a check access, for Penny, and you can see that she's contributor. Okay, meaning that she can do whatever she wants on the resource, even if she has no access to the control plane. So let's try that. AKS get credential. Let's see our configuration. So this is just the basic command. I need to specify. Now you can see that I have an admin access. So if I'm using this one, let's try to see get nodes. Probably ask me to authenticate. You can see that I can do whatever I want. I don't have any limitation. Usually getting nodes means that I have cluster-wide authorization. So that means that I have elevated access. Okay, so let's try to do that on the last cluster, which is defined with no local, because as you can see, it can be an issue. We should not be able to get admin access just because we are a contributor of the subscription, unless we are supposed to be admin, but then we should be in the admin group. So let's try to do that with this other group. Yes, get credential. Obviously, it cannot work. Good name. And clear my screen and do that again. And this time, you can see that I have a bad request because getting static credential is not allowed on this cluster because it is set to disable local accounts. So this is the way to avoid this weak-click inheritance that we get by being contributor of the cluster. Okay, so if I have to summarize this first part with the authorization, once we are authenticated with Azure ID, meaning that we can manage our identity in a Kubernetes with Azure Active Directory identity, either we manage the control plane only in Azure with Azure ABAC, or we want to manage with Kubernetes authorization inside the Kubernetes control plane, and then we need to manage that with a little more of knowledge of how it works in Kubernetes. To avoid unwanted escalation, I would recommend to disable the authorization, the local account on the cluster. Okay, that's all for now for the control plane authorization management. Now we switch back to another part. Oh, I just spoiled my slide. So I did have that on the slide. Okay, let's still in the control plane, but regarding the managed identity, because we are on the cloud platform, we probably have to manage access to other Azure objects from our Kubernetes cluster. And for that, we want to manage that with, less secret and password and more cloud identity. And the way we do that in Azure is with manage identity, and manage identity on the control plane can be either system assigned or user assigned. On this part, you can see I've shown you the little JSON extract over there. Either you stick with the system assigned identity. By default, it will work, but there may be some time when you need to grant access to your cluster to other Azure service. This is typically the case if you need to have what we call a private Kubernetes cluster, private AKS. In this case, if you have someone else managing the DNS, you need to have the ability for the cluster so that it can register itself at provisioning time on this DNS zone in Azure. So it needs to be granted an authorization before it's provisioned. And as you can see, in this case, the system assigned identity cannot work because it cannot be granted authorization because it's before it's provisioned. In this case, you need to have a user assigned identity. Again, on that part, in my experience, it doesn't cost more to use user assigned identity. So as long as you can use manage identity for the control plane, you should use manage identity, and it will solve a lot of headache if you plan beforehand the identity for your control plane. Okay, so that's the identity, so that the control plane can do stuff with other stuff in Azure. And I guess that's all for the control plane. So now we switch to the worker plane, which will be specifically about identity for Kubelet, because in Kubernetes, we mentioned that a little bit at the beginning. In the worker plane, everything is done by Kubelet. Kubelet is the agent for the worker, and without Kubelet, there is no Kubernetes. Well, no Kubernetes, not as a matter of fact. And because Kubelet may interact with other systems, it will come with manage identity. Again, so there is no complex things and configuration as we have seen before with the authorization access in the Kubernetes control plane. On the other hand, if you need to have your worker to access other Azure service, you will need to manage that with the Kubelet identity. So you will have either system or user managed identity for Kubelet, and you will have additional one because each time we will use an AKS add-on, which are typically things installed automatically from the Azure side inside our Kubernetes cluster. Additional managed identity will be created and added to our cluster. So we can see that. Let me show you that on my cluster. Where is my Windows? It should be this one. Okay. So if I'm going back to my clusters, so let's hide this one and hide this one. I think I can go directly inside of this one. And as you can see over there, I have I'm in the resource group, the backend resource group used by the cluster to store all its objects. Okay, and as you can see on this one, I have a few managed identity. So let's filter that by type. So you can see I have 3 managed identity. So we have the AKS AADR back agent pool. As the name seems to imply it, it is the basic Kubelet identity. And we have additional identity, one which is called Azure Policy and one which is called OMS Agent with the name of the cluster. Those are additional managed identity that were deployed when I configured extension, namely the Azure Policy extension and the OMS Agent extension, which is still called OMS, even if it should not be anymore, because as you probably know, it changed its name. Anyway, those are additional identity, but if I look at where they are assigned, you can see that in my node pool, I have an identity. My node pool is just a virtual machine scale set. And if I go in the user assign, you can see those identity are associated to my scale set, which means that if I switch back to my slide, all the managed identity that were added to my Azure plan were associated to my Kubernetes plan through the managed identity mechanism. Okay, and that's quite important because finally, under the hood, for most of the extension that will interact with your cluster and other Azure service, we'll have one dedicated identity, which, because it's dedicated, it can be granted access, granular access to the other Azure resource that they should be able to access, but they are granted access, they are associated to the virtual machine scale set. And the funny thing is that if you want, for instance, I have an example, I guess, about that. If you want to, for instance, use the CI/CD secret store add-on, which allows us to interact with Key Vault, we have in this case a dedicated Key Vault secret store provider managed identity, which will be used to grant access to the Key Vault and then allow us to manage secret. Okay. Fine with that. But this identity, if we use that, it's just assigned to the cluster, to the node pool, and finally, under the hood, nothing blocks us from using another managed identity that we assign to the cluster so that we can use it for other interactions. So this is a little limitation on that, I guess. Okay.
Cool. We got a good question for you, David. I'm just going to pop it up on screen. It says, what about service principal instead of using user assigned managed identity?
It depends what you want to do. But I have a few slides about that. We were talking about that with Richard at the beginning of the session when we were offline. We tend to not use service principal inside Kubernetes because, well, the trouble with the service principal is that we need to manage a password, which is called a secret in this case, and then we would need to use his secret inside Kubernetes, and we don't want to use that. So that's why we prefer to use managed identity. Nevertheless, if for an application workload, for any reason, you want to use a secret, a password for your application, you will probably use a Kubernetes secret, and in this case, the username would be the service principal, and the password would be a secret in your Kubernetes control plane, which would be referring to the secret in the Azure Active Directory plan. But in this case, the limitation is what we want to avoid, having more secret in the Kubernetes plan, which are stored in etcd. So there are ways to secure that and to encrypt that. Topic for another day. But ideally, if we can avoid managing password and rotating them, then we do that. And so that's why we prefer usually not to use service principal. There are some cases when we don't have the choice. For instance, if we need to interact with Azure things outside from Azure for another cluster, which is not an AKS cluster, that's not the topic. And in this case, we have no choice but to use that. Another story is to use workload identity, which until not so recently was only compatible with service principal, and that could have been the case. But I have more slides on that just for introduction afterward. That's now.
Thank you. Cool.
That's all for the worker plane. So as you've seen, a little less, well, not a little, much less complicated than the worker plane, because we don't have that much authorization to manage, but that makes sense. And mainly, AKS will manage for you the provisioning of the managed identity, and you will only need to verify that they are granted the proper access in the Azure plane afterward. And now, if we want to use identity for the application, in the past, we used something that was called pod identity. And as you can see on the slide, this is deprecated, so you should not use it. Don't use it. The idea was kind of interesting. As often in AKS, we are doing a juxtaposition of the Azure control plane for one part and the Kubernetes control plane for the other part. And we wanted to grant access to pod using managed identity. The trouble with pod, because they are containerized workload, they do not see the control plane in Azure, so we need to make a correspondence. And pod identity was doing that with a few architecture stuff, which brought custom resource definition and other strange thing with the non-managed identity daemon set, which was intercepting every call for Azure ID. It was kind of strange and from some people's point of view, maybe not that secure. Well, nevertheless, we don't need to care about that anymore because this is deprecated. And now we want to use workload identity. So workload identity is the new way to manage access for application living in pod in Azure Kubernetes service, and not only. And it relies on workload identity in Azure Active Directory and a mutating webhook, and also the OEDC provider URI that is configured on your cluster, which means that we need to configure the OEDC provider on AKS. We need to have a federated identity in workload in Azure ID. And with that, we can use a simple service account in terms of Kubernetes terminology that will be used by your pod to get access to other service. So much more elegant than pod identity at the end, even if pod identity was using CRD, which in my opinion is kind of elegant, but this is much more well thought, in my opinion, than the first iteration, and that's why it's also what the code name of pod identity v2. And it allows us to manage identity for pod in Azure service. The other advantage from workload identity that I've seen is that this is thought to be hybrid, meaning that you can install workload identity on not Azure Kubernetes service cluster, in any other cluster, as a matter of fact, and you will be able to grant access to your pod through the use of workload identity to workload living in Azure. There's a limitation. However, if we are in the Azure plane, we can use a managed identity. So we will configure on this example, this is the secret store, but you can see that we won't use pod identity, we will use a client ID, but this client ID will be either in Azure, the managed identity client ID, or it will be the service principal client ID in our cluster not living in Azure Kubernetes in Azure. But the very elegant things to know about workload identity, because I mentioned that we don't want to use service principal, is that if I understood that correctly, even if we are using a service principal inside another cluster, Kubernetes cluster, not in Azure, we don't need to manage the secret inside Kubernetes because it relies on the OEDC URL and the workload identity federation in Azure ID. So much more elegant, no secret management for a workload, which is what we want to achieve, either by using managed identity in Azure or by using service principal not in Azure for other cluster. Which brings me to the end of this presentation. I will probably have more detail in another time on workload identity, because this is the soon-to-be GA solution for workload identity management in Azure Kubernetes service. So I want to deep dive on that, but as you can see, I've talked for nearly an hour now. So let's stop for tonight. I have a summary, and then I will answer the remaining question if there are still some more. So we have 3 areas: control plane, worker plane, and workloads. I should add an S at workload because there are more than one. In the control plane, we have a lot of things to do. We can use, and we should use the manage AAD for authentication, which means the easy way to manage Azure ID integration. I'm not even sure we can use the legacy one anymore, so let's not try that. We should disable the local account to avoid uncontrolled privilege escalation. And then, in my opinion, it's still better to use Kubernetes airbag instead of only Azure airbag, so that we can be more granular. And whatever the other action, user assigned identity, or usually the way to go, so that you can plan beforehand the airbag assignment for your cluster outside of its own universe. For the worker plane, not much to do. Manage identity or provision automatically by the control plane and associated with all of your node pool, which are virtual machine scale set, and you will have additional manage identity for each add-on that you install. And last but not least, for workload identity should be adopted for development of new application that will be cloud native, meaning hosted in container in pod in Kubernetes, in Azure Kubernetes service, but using other service in Azure for stateful access or other things. And when possible, we should leverage also workload identity with either with the open source solution for external Kubernetes cluster or with the add-on. You can see that I removed the pod identity because when I first delivered this station, which was in September, workload identity was still not aware of manage identity. So at this time, there was kind of a regression of using workload identity. That's not the case anymore. So that's why you should use workload identity for your workload. And that's all for me.
Amazing. That was awesome.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks for having me again.
So, have you a talk on workload identities then? You're going to come back and deliver for us later in the year? Or?
If you want, yes, I would be happy to do that. I'm not ready yet. I need to do a few things, but it should be ready soon enough.
Yeah, I think that would be, the community would enjoy that, a real deep dive session on workload identities. So
yeah,
thanks a lot.
I think it goes GA in a few days as well, which is good. So a talk after it's gone GA would be amazing.
Yeah,
so, yeah, you got some time to make some slides. Yeah,
we'd be happy to.
That'd be good. Awesome.
We have a request in the chat about whether you'd be willing to share your slide deck.
Yeah.
I'll leave that up to you. If you want to share the slide deck, email me a link, like a GitHub link.
I have better than that because as I said, I played this session in September at the Cloud Identity Summit. So before that, I wrote the written version of this session in an article. Can I put the link somewhere in the chat?
If you pop it in the private chat, I can share
private
it.
Chat. Yep.
Yeah.
So you can have a look at that. This is on my blog. Usually when I'm doing a session at one point, I'm trying to have also the written version, so that I can give you the written version if you cannot attend to an event like that, or if I'm not able to deliver that in an event. Mm-hmm. So this one is already available. I'm French, so I'm apologizing for the English mistake that I may have done. Feel free to reach out to me if you see a mistake that I can correct.
Yeah,
Awesome.
your English is probably better than mine, so that's fine.
Oh, no.
You're getting plenty of love and appreciation in the chat tonight, which is good. I think a lot of folks, some new names that we've seen for the first time tonight as well. So a lot of appreciation and a lot of people finding that useful. So great session.
Yeah,
Thank you very much. Really appreciate
Thanks
it.
again for having me.
Look forward to having you back later in the year when you're ready to do that deep dive on workload identities.
Yeah,
I'll
just reach out
you
to us when you're ready.
Yeah, perfect. I will do
Cool.
that.
Awesome.
Right.
Well, that being said, thanks for joining us tonight at Azure Cloud Native. Look out in the next week or so for details on our March session. Look out for that on socials, Twitter and LinkedIn. Richard, anything else to sign off with?
No, just thanks everyone for attending and all the good questions. It's been awesome. Thank you.
See you next month.
All right. See you, everyone.
See you. Thanks. Bye.
Bye.